Justice Hunters is right around the corner, and in today's video I wanted to talk about what I felt were the most relevant or interesting staple cards that you should be aware of for the upcoming format. Do keep in mind that this video was recorded before we got a ban list, so I will be talking about these cards mostly in the context of the new decks that we're getting from Justice Hunters, but even if we do get a ban list, a lot of the things that I talk about with regards to the older decks will likely still be relevant, so do keep that in mind when watching the video. I'll also be doing the best hand traps in another separate video once we get more confirmation on what the ban list is going to be for the upcoming format, so do stay tuned for that. But with all that being said, let's hop straight into it with the going first cards. The first one I want to talk about is the Rumor Cannon. I think this card is fairly niche. Like, you might see it in very few decks as a thrust target for going first. It's usable into pretty much all the new decks aside from maybe like Dracotail because they can fuse face down, but I don't think it'll ever be like super high impact. I think if your deck can take advantage of playing a bunch of normal trap cards like something like Labyrinth or Paleo, then it can be pretty good, but other than that, I don't think this is a card you're going to be seeing too much in the upcoming format, just because it doesn't really do that much against any of the best decks. Dimensional Fissure and Macro Crossbones, on the other hand, I think could be something with a ton of potential. Not considering decks like Malice right now, if you just think about the new decks like K9, Dracotail, and Yummy, this type of card does really hurt a deck like Dracotail and Yummy because they benefit a lot from having cards in the graveyard. The Dracotail monsters get their effects only when they're sent to the graveyard for a fusion summon, and the Yummy monsters love recurring their bodies back from the graveyard with their synchro monsters. So it's going to be very difficult for either of those decks to really do much to a floodgate like this while it's face up. Against a deck like Vanquish Soul, it's still fine. It's not great because like it doesn't necessarily shut off any of their plays other than just adding stuff back from the graveyard or using Azuna to dump Lupus. So I think that even though it doesn't really hit K9 that hard, this is a card that has a lot of potential that could be good against a deck like Yummy and Dracotail. And hey, who knows, maybe if Malice is still around, they could pivot to playing this card in their side deck instead. And then next up we have Crossout and Callby. I think these are definitely going to be format staples. Of course, there's still going to be hand traps running around. High impact hand traps like Charmies are presumably still going to be played in most people's decks, and I think having access to these cards to stop them is really good. Not to mention, because a lot of decks are playing on like turn 0 now, if you have a card like Azuna and they're dumping like Lupus, well, Crossout could be good if you're playing Azuna in your deck, and then Callby can even be good to hit a card like Lupus to prevent them from being able to XC someone on your turn. So not much to really say about both these cards. I think both these cards are still going to be very, very powerful format staples. Next up are a few new cards that you probably have never even heard about before. The first one is the Eye of Truth, and I guess cards that are sort of like this. The gist of these cards are that your opponent has to play with their hand revealed, and why this is important, because against the Vanquish Soul deck, they're required to reveal cards from their hand in order to get their effects, but if their hand is already revealed, the ruling, I believe, is that like they aren't allowed to activate effects that would reveal cards because the cards themselves are already revealed. So pretty much in a nutshell, this card would prevent the Vanquish Soul monsters from having any additional effects in addition to the ones that they have on summon, and I think that if Vanquish Soul K9 were to ever be like the tier 0 most dominant deck, this card could maybe see play. But even though this card in theory shuts down Vanquish Soul completely, I think this is still just going to be relegated to the niche tier. If we look at the OCG, cards like this aren't being played at all. I think that's just because it's just too specific and doesn't really do anything against any other matchups. Like, yes, in theory it's nice to have the hand knowledge, but it is just a strict -1 card advantage most of the time because you're not really gaining anything from it. So unless Vanquish Soul, I think, becomes the most dominant tier 0 deck, like maybe like Tier Limits was here in the TCG, I don't think that this type of card is going to see that much play. Next up is Chain Disappearance, and Chain Disappearance, for those of you who don't know, is whenever your opponent summons a monster with 1000 or less attack, you banish that monster, and then your opponent banishes all copies of that monster from their deck. So this would be used against the Yummy deck specifically because all their monsters are very small. This card is interesting because while I think Yummy is going to be a very strong deck, I don't think it's going to be nearly as dominant as something like Vanquish Soul K9. I think we'll kind of have like a Mitsurugi Raizio versus Malice situation where K9 Vanquish Soul becomes like Mitsurugi Raizio in terms of representation, and then the second best deck, but still a decent distance behind, is going to be like Yummy. So I don't think you have to side like cards like Chain Disappearance, in my opinion, because while Yummy is going to be very good, I don't think it's going to be that popular to where you're justified in playing this in your deck. Not to mention, it also doesn't necessarily like completely shut them out of their turn. Like, you could remove their normal summon in theory, and they do have a bunch of other extenders in their deck. I guess one interesting thing to note about this card is I believe the ruling with this versus Obedience Schooled is if your opponent uses Obedience Schooled, summons all 3 of the Yummies, and then you chain this, as far as I know, all the Yummies are going to be like banished from the field and from their deck. So in that case, I guess it could be pretty devastating. But a lot of the times, I feel like that situation isn't going to happen. And most people probably aren't going to be choosing to play this card specifically as Yummy Hate. Another card that could potentially be good as Yummy Hate is Power Filter, and Power Filter just says monsters with 1000 or less attack cannot be special summoned, and is a continuous spell floodgate. So I think this card is a little bit better than Change's appearance. It'll constantly be on the field throughout the entire game, and it'll pretty much completely shut the Yummy deck off because I believe all their monsters are like 1000 or less attack. They pretty much won't be able to do anything until they out this card. So I think that even though Yummy won't be the best deck, this could almost sort of be like the quote-unquote artifact sanctum that people were citing for like Malice in this current format. Like, yes, Malice is the second best deck, but it is a very strong deck. So some people still cited cards like artifact sanctum to beat them. And I think that card like Power Filter could sort of fulfill that role. It won't be good against any of the other decks, but it'll be very, very good against Yummy. Next up is Lullaby of Obedience. I think Lullaby is probably something that's like very niche. It's definitely okay in a lot of mirror matches, and if you expect to play a bunch of mirror matches like Vanquish Soul or K9, then I guess it could be fine, especially in the K9 Vanquish Soul stuff. Like, even if they add the cards to your hand, like a lot of the cards are just able to summon themselves onto the field. So in-engine cards like Borger or the new K9 cards like Azuna, like no matter what your opponent does with them, like getting that extra monster for free is going to be really good. So I think it has some potential in the K9 Vanquish Soul matchup. It's probably fine in other mirror matches as well, but I feel like unless you want to specifically play more engine cards in your deck, in your side deck, then you probably want to focus more on like the non-engine aspect of like these side deck cards. There isn't really a card like Speedway Terratop like back in the day where like no matter what deck you were playing, every deck had like the Zodiac engine in it, and if you stole Terratop, that was really good. But nowadays, I don't think there really is a card like that, aside from maybe potentially Azuna. Next up are the Solemn cards. I think that all of these are like pretty high potential in terms of being able to be good in the side deck. Like, all of them are obviously great at going first cards. They trade very well into a lot of the best decks. Each one I think has its very own specific uses. Like, for example, I think a card like Judgment's going to be very good in Yummy specifically because people might be citing board breakers like Dark Ruler No More against them. And I think that being able to stop that is going to be really good. On the other hand, against a deck like Dracotail, well, Strike is probably not going to be that good because they have a lot of fusion effects through their spell cards. But then that's where Solemn Warning will come in because you're able to stop like the fusion effects. So I think that depending on which matchup you play, like one of these is going to be better than the other. But overall, I think that all of these are very high quality cards and definitely still very generically powerful cards that you can be putting into any side deck, and it'll probably still be good no matter what the format is. And then next up are like Gozen, Rivalry, and Tcg, like those types of floodgates. I think in general, like Gozen and Rivalry are actually something with a bit of potential this upcoming format. If you think about the Vanquish Soul K9 deck, like all their stuff is like inherently different attributes and different types. So if you're playing a deck like Yummy, for example, that are mostly light beasts, you can take advantage of both of these cards against like the best deck of the format. And I think that for that reason, I'm going to put these cards in like high potential. Like, these cards haven't really seen much play up until now, but I think it could be a huge blowout against like the Vanquish Soul K9 deck. Hey, even like against the Dracotail deck as well, there's some potential to lock them out of like, depending on how they start. So overall, I think that these cards are both very good side cards, and I think that if you have the ability to play them in your deck, you can even potentially keep this in going second against Vanquish Soul K9, and you could just completely devastate them if they don't have an out to this. On the other hand, I think that Tcg is fine. It really depends how well like a deck like Yummy does, in my opinion, and if like whether Malice is still alive in this upcoming format post banlist. I think these are very good against those decks specifically, but I think they're probably like, maybe you could argue like a step below like Gozen and Rivalry because they don't do anything to the perceived best deck in Vanquish Soul K9. I'll still put it in high potential because I think this is still a very devastating card against the right matchups, but just keep in mind that this doesn't hit like what the perceived best deck is in Vanquish Soul K9. And then we have Graver, the Super Ancient Organism. I think this card is going to be very niche. It doesn't really do anything in most matchups other than like maybe Dracotail, but then Dracotail even has an in-engine way to out this, so I don't really think this card's going to be good. Magic Deflector, I think, is probably going to be unplayable this format. Like, there isn't any really key, like, equip spells, quick play spells, or field spells out of, like, the new decks, as far as I know anyways. Shared Ride, I think, is something that's, like, very niche. I think most of the times you would rather play a card that just stops your opponent from doing it, as opposed to drawing every time they do something. So a good comparison would be, like, Mistaken Arrest, in my opinion. I think Mistaken Arrest is still going to be a very high potential card in this upcoming format. Being able to completely shut out Vanquish Soul K9's ability to search can be pretty devastating, and it's good against a lot of other decks as well. Playing a card that prevents your opponent from doing that rather than a card that lets you plus off of doing that. Like, you can think about Shared Ride as sort of like the Mulcharmy, where it gives your opponent a choice. Like, they can choose to keep searching and giving you cards, whereas Mistaken Arrest just says, nope, doesn't matter what you want to do, like, you're not able to do it. So I think that Mistaken Arrest is probably a little bit better than Shared Ride, but I think both cards will have their uses in this upcoming format. Next up is deck lockdown. I think that deck lockdown is also something with a ton of potential. Not only does it stop searching as well, but the restriction that prevents your opponent from special summoning from deck can also be solid. It does stop a few extra cards like in the top decks. Like if you think about a deck like Vanquish Soul, they have Stake Your Soul. You're able to prevent that from resolving, which would normally be able to get around the search lock. And against a deck like Yummy, you can prevent Obedience School from resolving. So I think that this deck lockdown is something that may even be considered better than Mistaken Arrest because it has that bonus effect. But do keep in mind that it does stay on the field for multiple turns, and there is a chance it's going to hurt your deck as well, more so than Mistaken Arrest, because Mistaken Arrest only lasts 2 turns. But deck lockdown, I think, is definitely something with a ton of potential in this upcoming format and could be a really nasty floodgate in the right deck. And then next up, we have Salesman in the context of going first. Some of you may notice that like Salesman comes up twice on this tier list, and the first time I'm going to talk about it is in the context of just strictly using it as a going first card. So I think in the case where you use it as a going first card, I would say it's like almost unplayable. Like I'd say like very, very niche situations where like you would want to side this in going first. Call a card like Droll and Lockbird if let's say Droll and Lockbird is the only card that your deck loses to. Think something like Heraldic Ryziel last format or something like that. Other than that, I don't think there's any reason you should just be blind calling like a random hand trap, considering your opponent just won't even have it 2/3 of the time. So I think that for that reason, Salesman in terms of going first, it's just going to be a very, very niche card that's going to be played by like maybe some like super combo deck that like only loses to Droll or something like that. Next up, we have Anti-Spell Fragrance. I think this card is also like pretty niche. Like you'll against like the perceived best deck of Vanquish Soul K9, they don't actually play that many spell cards. And even though their spell cards are obviously really good, it's not like they don't have ways to out it as well with their main monster engine. So I don't think this card's gonna be very good against them. I think this card has some potential against Dracotail and Yummy. It's not like this card will auto shut off those decks as well either, which is why I'm kind of putting in the niche here. It's probably fine against Dracotail and Yummy, but I feel like if you want to play Floodgates, there are probably better ones that are more impactful against those decks. Next up is Spell card Monster Reborn. I also think this card is going to be very niche. I'm not sure if Malice is going to be around after a potential ban list, but if whether it is or isn't, I think this is ultimately still just going to be a very, very niche card. Like, I don't think there's any deck that really tries to like summon out stuff from their graveyard during either both players' turn outside of Yummy. So in theory, you could, let's say if your opponent only has like 1 copy of Snatchy in the graveyard, you could just like rob the Snatchy with Spell card Monster Reborn when they go to take out, and that could be good, preventing them from synchro summoning on your turn. But outside of that very specific use case, I don't think there are too many decks that can take full advantage of like the Spell card Monster Reborn, outside of maybe Malice. Next up is Spellbound. I would say Spellbound is pretty unplayable in this upcoming format, in my opinion. Like, I don't think there's a deck that this card is really useful against. Like, all the best decks just have ways to keep putting monsters out onto the board and threatening to go into their extra deck early before Spellbound even gets any value. Next up is Imperial Ironwall, and Imperial Ironwall is pretty much strictly on here for if Malice is still a relevant deck afterwards. If it's not relevant, obviously, like, I'd put it in unplayable. If it's, like, still decent and, like, top 5, like, I'd say it's a very niche side deck card. Like, even in the current format where Malice is the second best deck, not many decks have the ability to play Imperial Ironwall or choose not to play it. So, overall, I think it's just a very niche and specific hate card for Malice if your deck has a very big problem with that. Next up is Black Goat Laughs. I think Black Goat Laughs is something that's like also pretty niche. Like, unless you feel like we're in a format where you don't want to play like any Floodgates, or like if Floodgates just become very bad in this upcoming format, I think Black Goat Laughs could be an okay generic side card that's good against like everything in theory, but I feel like it's never going to be able to completely shut out an opponent's turn most of the time. There are key monsters in the K9, Yummy, and Dracotail decks, but even if you call them and prevent your opponent from like using their effects, I think that decks are still playable. Like, they can still get around the fact that Black Goat prevents them from using those effects on one turn, because all of those decks have the ability to play on both players' turn. Like, even if you shut off their key monsters for a single turn, they can in theory just use it in the following turn as well. So I feel like Black Goat Laughs will kind of be relegated to decks as maybe like a niche one of if those decks play like Foolish Burial Goods. And then next up we have Different Dimension Ground. I think this is something with a ton of potential. Similar idea as like Dimensional Fissure. It's gonna be pretty good against Yummy and Dracotail. Not the greatest against K9 Vanquish Soul, but the fact that it hits Yummy and Dracotail, I think, and like a bunch of other rogue decks, I think this card is still something with a lot of potential. And then for the, I guess, virus cards, I think first Eradicator, the one that hits spells and traps, I think this one's gonna be like pretty niche. Like, I would say like almost borderline unplayable. Like I mentioned, I think Yummy and Dracotail, you can argue, are the decks that like rely on their spells a little bit more, but once again, I think that both decks still have very competent ways of being able to play even without their spell cards if you somehow resolve this against them going first. I don't think this card's gonna be that great. But like the other virus on the other hand, like the one that blows up monsters that are less than a certain attack or like more than a certain attack, whatever, I think this one has a little bit more potential than the spell trap one, just because like you can make an argument that like, hey, the yummies are all really tiny. If you just blow up all of them in the hand, it can be really bad for your opponent and can make it really difficult for them to play. But I feel like the problem nowadays with cards like the viruses is that if you hit one aspect of their deck, the other side of their deck, whether it be monsters or spells, are just able to pick up the slack and still generate bodies onto the board and let them keep playing. So I don't think that either the viruses are particularly great in this upcoming format. Maybe if deck building trends go like one way where people start cutting certain spells or something like that, like sure, like these could be better, but for now I don't think that these are going to be very good. Next up is Power Sink Stone and Skill Drain. I think that Power Sink Stone and Skill Drain sort of fall in the same boat. They essentially do the same thing for the most part. I think both are just like pretty niche options. Like I don't think many decks have the ability to play them very well, and even the decks that they do, like yeah, like they're gonna be pretty good most of the time against like the best decks, but like a deck like Dracotail just has an in-engine way to out these floodgates, which is something you need to consider. And then decks like Vanquish Soul K9 can just like do a bunch of effects in the hand, or like the Vanquish Soul player can like activate the effect on the field and then chain a guy to bounce it back, and then that effect will resolve because it's off the field now. So I think that these cards are very niche. I don't think there's a deck that I can think of off the top of my head that really wants to play this. These are still obviously strong floodgates, but I don't think that they're going to be like format defining or anything like that. Next up is Dimensional Barrier and Simul Archfiends. I'll start off with Simul Archfiends. I think this is a very niche option. Like this was essentially like the quote unquote D barrier for Lynx, but now in this upcoming format with the new decks we're getting, I don't think that this card's gonna be very good or very usable. Dimensional Barrier, on the other hand, I think is also something with high potential. Once again, like different Dimension Ground, it has the potential to be very good against Dracotail and Yummy. Just being able to call Synchro against Yummy and being able to call Fusion against Dracotail, I think can be a pretty solid card. Just being able, it could almost completely shut out their turn entirely. Not to mention if decks like Ryzeal are still a thing, like you can call XYZ as well, and it can be pretty good in those cases. The only thing is, it's not going to really do anything against the perceived best deck of Vanquish Soul K9, so that's just something to keep in mind. And you'll notice that's a common trend with all of these cards. I think one of the reasons that deck is so good is because it's very hard to side against that deck. Like, there aren't any, like, really evident, like, silver bullets like there are for other decks out there. And then we have Silent Graveyard. I think this card is going to be pretty unplayable. There isn't really a deck that heavily relies on graveyard effects that we're getting outside of maybe Dracotail. But the thing is with Dracotail, like, why would you not just play a card like Different Dimension Ground instead that, like, also does the same thing but is a little bit more flexible? And then finally for the last going first card, I think that Unending Nightmare is also going to be unplayable. We don't really have any, like, continuous spells or traps that need to be constantly popped in this upcoming format, so I think you'd rather just play any other card. Next up we have Fenrir. I think Fenrir is probably going to be fine in this upcoming format. Like, you can make the argument, like, similar to Pankratops, like, it is a card against Yummy where you could, in theory, summon it, run something over, and then anytime your opponent uses a monster effect, you can, like, target something to out it, which can be solid. And I think that it'll sort of fall in a similar boat as Pankratops. I'll put them both in, like, high potential. I think that these cards do have the potential to be very good against a deck like Yummy, just because of how the deck plays. But outside of that, like, I think they'll probably just be okay in every other matchup. Like, in the K9 Vanquish Soul matchup, I think they're, like, fine, not exceptional. They do offer you some maneuverability in those matchups going second, which is nice. I don't think these cards will do too much to a deck like Dracotail, and, like, these cards weren't seeing play, like, before this current format, so I think that the reason these cards are even so high are because it has a lot of potential against the Yummy deck, and it's probably okay into everything else. So if you do choose to side these cards, they probably won't be dead in most matchups, but they may not be that high impact. And then next up are the Kaijus. I think that, like, all these are, like, pretty niche cards at the moment. Like, I wouldn't say they're awful, because there are some decks that can take advantage of them. Cards like Santa Claus or the Kaijus are in theory going to be good against a deck like Lunalight, if that deck suddenly becomes more popular now. Their towers is still a very difficult card for a lot of decks to out. A similar idea with Lava Golem, just being able to out those towers monsters. And in theory, I guess against a deck like Yummy, since a lot of their interruption is, like, very monster heavy, you could in theory cut off, like, most of their interruption just by giving them a single Lava Golem. Zero Mode, I think, like, I would say is almost borderline unplayable, because, like, a lot of decks I think don't have to ever summon 3 bodies onto the board, but same idea as Lava Golem. There are potential uses for this for certain decks. And then finally we have Kurikara. I think Kurikara is also something that's, like, very niche. I don't really think it'll be too good in this upcoming format. Like maybe you can catch like some Vanquishable K9 opponents off guard, because they will keep cards like Holly Sue on the board, they'll keep cards like Caesar, Raisin on the board, and they're like, once they've used their effects, like most of the time they probably won't be playing around a card like this. And in theory, at least, this could be a good way to remove them after your opponent resolves a card like Snow Devil and prevents them from being destroyed by card effects. You could just in theory wipe out their entire board and summon this and go for game. But it hasn't really seen that much play in practice in the OCG, and I personally don't think that Kurikara is that great of a card at the moment, but I wouldn't be surprised, I guess, if someone finds a niche use for it. Next up is Herald of the Abyss. I would argue that this card is still unplayable, even though we technically have a Towers monster in Lunalight Liger Dancer. I think there are just better options like a Kaiju, especially because Herald of the Abyss is a spell card that your opponent can just negate with their Silver Hound in the graveyard that they're always getting to if they're able to set up their full combo. So I don't think that Herald of the Abyss is something that is worth playing, in my opinion. Next up, we have like the back removal cards in Duster and Lightning Storm. I think that both of these, I would say like are almost format staples. I want to say like maybe Duster is a format staple just because of how many matchups it can hit and how in theory it's good against everything. And then Lightning Storm something with like high potential. I think that it really depends on how people are going to choose their to build their decks. If they're playing a bunch of Floodgates, then sure, like these cards are going to be great post side. But if they're not, then against like the best decks, I don't think a card like Lightning Storm being able to potentially clear monsters is going to be that great, especially because Vanquishable has a card like Snow Devil, which can prevent their cards from being destroyed by card effects, and then the Yummy stuff can like they can just summon their guys in defense mode, so it doesn't really do anything to that. But if back row is still a popular thing that people are putting into their decks, then I think these cards are still going to be okay. Twin Twisters is still unplayable. I don't see a reason to ever play this over like any of the mass board clears. And then Cosmic Cyclone, I think, is also something that's like pretty niche in this upcoming format. It's probably fine. We do get some key field spells in this format now. You can, in theory, hit cards like the Vanquishable field spell, and it's almost like a quote-unquote 2-for-1. And especially because since they only play one, they probably won't get access back to it ever again in that game. Similar in the Yummy matchup as well, they have like 2 key field spells that they like to cycle through, and if you're able to banish one of them, it can potentially cut off a key part of their follow-up or their end board. So I think that Cosmic is something that's like fine. I don't think it'll be really great because it's not like your opponents are playing like 3 copies of those cards and rely on them like to get their play started as well. So I think that for that reason, I'll put Cosmic in the niche tier. It's probably alright, but I don't really think it's going to be incredibly powerful. Raigeki and Dark Hole, I would say like these cards are probably very, very niche. Like the only reason I'm not putting them in like unplayable is because I think the theory is against like Yummy, not every Yummy player is going to just end on like the Herald of the Arclight right away, whether it's because they choose not to or they start with Obedience School, like they're locked into not summoning it. I think in theory, if your first action is activate Raigeki or Dark Hole, there is some world where that can be fairly impactful against the Yummy deck. It's probably okay against like other decks as well outside of like Vanquishable K9 because once again they have the ability to protect their board, but in theory these cards could potentially remove like some aspects of their end board like the K9 XEs or something like that, and that could take out the Ripper effect to negate, as well as the rank up spell being able to put a werewolf on top of that. So in theory it could trade with multiple cards, but I think that's just in theory. Like in practice I don't really think any of these cards can be super great. Next up is Book of Moon. I would say Book of Moon is like almost borderline unplayable. Like all these decks just have so many extenders and so many ways to put monsters out onto the board that I don't think a single Book of Moon is ever going to be enough to stop them. Book of Eclipse on the other hand is like probably something that's like very niche. I think in theory against like Yummy it could be decent, because even going second, like if your opponent just has like a bunch of dudes on the board, you can activate Book of Eclipse, and hey, if you don't have Herald of the Arclight already, then no, even if they tag out into their other guys, all their guys are going to be face down, and then except their Link monster, and they won't be able to synchro summon after that, unless they have like a way to bring another body onto the board with a card like Yummy, surprise. So I think that little bit of extra utility going second into certain matchups, I think could make it so Book of Eclipse is a little bit more of a niche card, but I don't really think it's going to be super great into most of the matchups that we have. Forbidden Droplet, on the other hand, I almost want to say this is like a format staple, and you know what, I will say it's a format staple. The reason I'm saying that is because a lot of decks are going to be playing on turn 0 now. If you think about K9 Vanquishable, like they're going to be able to very easily use cards like Holy Sue and use cards like Azuna to start playing on your turn, and if they're able to resolve those cards on your turn, it can just be devastating. Like it can almost be game losing in a lot of times. Like you could lose the game on your very first turn before your opponent even draws a card for their turn. Like that's how powerful these like hand interactions can be. I think that having a card that's able to stop them on your turn 0 and still be good going second into boards as well is something that you want to consider putting into your decks. Yes, it is a very expensive card in terms of card economy, but I think that it is going to be worth it because if you're able to just start off like a card like Holisu or Zuna, you trap those cards onto the board, and then most decks just have a way to very easily remove them before passing it back to your opponent, so that'll be taking away a card from your opponent as well. So for that reason, I think that Droplet is something with a ton of potential this upcoming format. I would not be surprised if this card becomes a very, very potent staple just because of its ability to be able to stop those turn 0 interactions. And then next up is Forbidden Chalice. I think that even though this card is normally not very good, I think that in this upcoming format, similar reasons as Droplet, it has some potential to be able to cut off those like turn 0 interaction cards. And I think that could be reason enough to play it. But other than that, I think like you probably just want to stick with Droplets because it makes it so your opponent has no way to dodge, no way to really respond to it if you send a monster. Like, for example, if your opponent uses Holisu effect, well, if you chain Forbidden Chalice, in theory, they can have a card like Borger to bounce it back to the hand, whereas with a card like Droplet, if you send a monster, there's nothing they can really do to prevent the Droplet from resolving. Next up is Super Poly. I think Super Poly is something with a lot of potential this upcoming format as well. It's going to be pretty good. I think it's going to be pretty solid against the Yummy deck, depending on what they end on. They could end on a bunch of, like, Light Beasts, and then boom, you could Garura, hit away their Synchros before they're able to take out. That could be pretty solid. Against the Dracotail deck, there's a really nasty fusion monster. I forgot what it's called, but essentially it's like a floodgate against the Dracotail deck, preventing them from using Spellcaster and Dragon effects. And if that deck ever becomes really good, then I think Super Poly just is like a one-card answer to that, because you just poly away their board, and then summon a floodgate that they're pretty much not going to be able to do anything to. So I think that Super Poly is something with a ton of potential this upcoming format, but unfortunately, like most of the other cards in the high potential tier, it just doesn't really do anything against K9 Vanker Soul, which I think most people expect to be the best deck. So for that reason, I can't put it in format staple. One card that I do want to consider putting in format staple is like evenly matched. I'll probably put it in high potential for now because I don't think every deck's going to be able to play it. But I think the theory is that like even against a deck like Vanker Soul, evenly can be decent. Like, it's never going to like completely wipe their board and prevent them from summoning any interactions at all, because if you think about like let's say you let the Vanker Soul player, K9 player, go off, they're probably ending on like maybe 5 or 6 cards in hand. They're ending with like the Field Spell plus like plus Snow Devil set plus like whatever they have on the board. Let's say like Rock, 2 Vanker Soul monsters, maybe like a K9 Xyz or something like that. But if you go evenly, you can wipe out pretty much everything but the Snow Devil, and it'll sort of almost quote-unquote reset your opponent down to having like only 5 or 6 cards. And while their opponents, like I said, is still going to be able to play the game, I do think that evenly matched can make it so going second is a little bit more doable against the Vanker Soul K9 deck. It'll definitely make it so your engine has a much better chance of being able to push through all their interactions, as opposed to if you just let your opponent keep everything. It probably isn't going to be too good against like the Yummy deck, because they do have a way to set up an Omni Negate during the main phase or the battle phase. And against a deck like Dracotail, I think this is almost like 50-50. It really depends on what your opponent chooses to put on their end board, because their trap card, they don't have a trap card as far as I know that negates trap effects. Like, they have a trap card that negates a spell card, but they don't really have a good way to beat evenly. So I think that depending on what your opponent ends on and how much follow-up they add to their hand with like cards like 5 mana, the one that lets them fusion summon on your turn, and like how many hand traps they drew, like I think in theory it could be decent in that matchup as well. But this is something I think like has a ton of potential, and we'll kind of have to see how the format progresses in order to see how good this card really is. Next up is Gordian Slicer. I think Gordian Slicer is something that has like is like very niche. If Mitsurugi is still a very competent deck, like I think this card could see some play in those decks. But outside of that very specific deck, I don't really think too many other ones can take full advantage of Gordian Slicer. And even though Gordian Slicer's effect I think could be solid into every single matchup, I think the cost is just way too steep for this card to really see too much play. Next up is Dark Ruler No More. I think Dark Ruler No More is something with high potential as well. Against a deck like Yummy, for example, you will be able to stop a card. You should be able to shut off most of their end board, because a lot of their end board is like concentrated on the monsters. In theory, Dark Ruler can be pretty good against that, and you'll only have to deal with like a Yummy Surprise as well as any other hand traps that they have. But even then, like the deck still plays so much non-engine that like it still could be hard to push through their board even after you Dark Ruler them. Dark Ruler is probably like very iffy against like Vanker Soul K9. Like they have many ways to just like bounce their guys back to hand to reset them. So realistically the only things you're stopping are like maybe Rock and whatever rank 5 Xyz that they put on their end board. So I think in that matchup it's probably meh, not very good. Against the Dracotail matchup, like they have a way to negate it with the in-engine trap, and I don't think that like they necessarily are ending on like too many fusion monsters that are able to interrupt you on your turn. So I don't think that Dark Ruler is going to be good in those matchups, but I think it's like evenly, it really depends how the format shapes up and how popular each of these new decks are. So I think it's kind of hard to say before we actually see like any results. Next up, we have Thrust and Talents. I think that these are also going to be format staples. Like I mentioned with droplets, like there's going to be a lot of turn 0 interaction. Right now, like your opponent's going to drop Holy Seal on you, your opponent's going to drop like Izuna on you turn 0. And having cards like this can be very, very impactful. Like Thrust, being able to go first and guaranteed like search something to your hand instead of just setting it is incredibly strong. And of course, Talents is obviously really good if your opponent plays during your turn. So not much to really say about these two cards. I think that these two cards are going to be, like droplets, are going to be the ways that people are considering when choosing cards to beat like the turn 0 interactions that I talked about. I think Ultimate Slayer is something with like high potential as well. In theory, it can be pretty good against the Yummy deck, being able to send a card like Malong, bounce one of their like synchro monsters, and then Malong can threaten something else right away is pretty solid. Even against a deck like Vanquish Soul, like in theory, if your deck can play like all the good Ultimate Slayer targets, like no matter what they end on, you could like trade like 2 for 1 essentially. Like you'll get rid of either, let's say, one of their Xyz monsters and then negate like one of their Vanquish Soul monsters with like Aggregator or something like that. Or if they end on like just a Link monster, you could send like Bucephalus to shuffle the Link monster back before they get to add, and then Bucephalus sends Garura to draw a card. So like in all these cases, like they're probably always going to trade 2 for 1 into most of the top decks. And I think we're also entering a format where board breakers are a little bit more viable and a little bit better. So I think that a card like Ultimate Slayer could start seeing some play again, in my opinion. But like with Dark Ruler and Evenly, I think it really depends how the format shapes up and how people choose to build their decks and what they choose to end on. Next up is Change of Heart. I think Change of Heart and like these stealing type cards, I want to say, are like borderline unplayable. Like against Vanquish Soul, they have so many ways to tag out. Against a deck like Yummy, they also inherently tag out. And against like Dracotail, they have a spell negate and they're able to quick effect fuse during either player's turn as well. So I don't think that these cards are ever going to gain too much value unless you very specifically like try to steal an Xyz monster like Nash Knight. I think even if you try to steal, like, let's say, a K9 Xyz monster that isn't, like, a Vanquish Soul card, your opponent most likely has the Quick Play spell to rank up on top as well. So your opponent can just use that to dodge Change of Heart. And I just feel like there's just not that many good cards worth stealing that are left. Then if your opponent always has a way to, like, dodge the targeting effects with their engine, like, I don't really think that, like, Change of Heart's ever going to be super high impact. So all that is to say is, I don't think this card's going to be very good, but I'm not putting it unplayable because I think the card quality of just being able to take your opponent's card and then use his effect is still something that could be very relevant in this upcoming format. Next up is Metatronus. I think Metatronus has gotten a little bit worse from last format. If you think about the best decks, like right now, once again, they all have ways to like dodge these like sort of targeting effects. Like against a deck like Vanquish Soul, well, let's say you target a guy, they can just chain something else to like bounce it back to hand. I don't think that like Metatronus is going to be exceptional in this upcoming format. It really depends, once again, how popular a deck like how viable a deck like Malice or Ryzeal is. If those decks are still viable, like sure, I would put it at like maybe bottom of high potential because it could still be used against those decks. But hypothetically, if Malice and Ryzeal aren't decks we need to consider anymore, and just strictly against like Dracotail, Vanquish Soul, K9, and Yummy, I don't think that this card is going to be very good. And then next up we have Salesman. Once again, this is Salesman in the context of going second. I think that this is something at like, I would also put like at the bottom of high potential. I think that in theory, like, it really depends on if Malice and Ryzeal are still a thing, because if those are still things, you can still call cards like Detonator and Whitebinder. But if those aren't a thing, against the best decks, like, maybe you can call, like, certain key monsters. Like against Vanquish Soul, you could, in theory, call Raisin. That could cut them off from being able to get access to a attribute they might need. Prevents them from blowing up the column you're in. Against Yummy, you can call, like, one of their, like, key synchro monsters. It could be fine in that case. But I feel like unless we have like Detonator and Whitebinder still in the format, I don't really think that this card's going to be any higher than like Niche. But assuming that we do, I'll just put it in high potential for now. I think this card is still versatile enough going second. Being able to cut off like key end board pieces could be enough for your deck to allow your deck's engine to just push through. Next up is Enemy Controller. I would say Enemy Controller is like almost like borderline unplayable as well, but I'll put it in Niche because in theory, I guess, in the Mitsurugi deck, like, if that deck's still alive, you can get pretty good value out of it by tributing your reptile monsters to attempt to steal your opponent's monsters. But that becomes a bit of a problem because like Change of Heart and Metatronus, these targeting effects have very easy ways to be dodged by all the top decks. So I think it's something that's like very, very niche, and maybe we'll see some play. Finally, we have Vesper Gearsu. Vesper Gearsu is an interesting one because I think against like any deck that isn't Mega Soul K9, I would put this card as like almost unplayable. There isn't really any reason your opponent ever has to like, you know, keep any less than like 2 monsters, I think. So I feel like Vesper Gearsu is never going to be trading that favorably into those decks. But something that's interesting is like against the Vanquish K9 deck, for those of you who don't know, like they require cards in their hand to like reveal to do their Vanquish Soul effects. Let's say like you Vesper Gearsu them, you kind of force them to go down to 1 monster, because if they go down to 2 or more, like they'll have to banish their hand or like won't be able to use monster effects. And if they banish their hand, like their Vanquish Soul monsters are essentially turned off. So it kind of forces your opponent to go down to 1 monster, if that makes sense. But even if you, let's say you successfully resolve Vesper Gearsu, force your opponent down to 1 monster, I mean, they still have so many cards in hand that they can play with. I don't think that this card's ever going to be enough to really break their boards for the most part, but I did want to bring it up because I thought that was a kind of cool interaction that some people might have missed when reading over this card. So, in general, I think it's a very, very niche card. I don't think it's going to be particularly great, but I won't put it in unplayable because I think at the very least it has some potential in the Vanquish Soul K9 matchup. Alright, so that's going to do it for this tier list. I know it was a bit of a long one, but do let me know what you thought about in the comment section below. Do you think I missed any cards, or would you move some of these cards around to different tiers? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm curious to hear what you think. Once again, keep in mind this was recorded before we got a ban list, so this tier list is mostly based on the assumption that like we're only considering decks like Vanquish Soul K9, Yummy, and Dracotail, all the new decks that come out from the Justice Hunter set. We're not really considering old decks like Mitsurugi Raziel or Mouse. At least not that much anyways. With all that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.